and welcome to this Real Story Group webinar, The Right Way to Select WCM Technology. Really exciting topic for me. I founded Real Story Group, originally a CMS watch in 2001 to cover what we then called the Web CMS industry. A lot of interesting twists and turns over the last 17 years, many things staying the same, but this is a core part of what we do as an analyst firm is help our subscribers select the right WCM technology, and we believe that there's definitely a specific way that you should do that, and I'm going to share that methodology with you today. If you are a Real Story Group subscriber, you'll get a link to a recording to this call. Everyone else, you will get a link to the copy of the deck itself, so you will get a copy of the deck. Now, I invite you to share any questions or comments, things you agree with, things you disagree with, by using the questions tab in your GoToMeeting control panel. We'll be monitoring that, and there'll definitely be time for questions and answers at the end. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. Many of you know Real Story Group, some of you don't. Just want to fill you in here. We're a different kind of analyst firm. We work exclusively with buyers like you. And what we've been doing for the last 17 years is deeply analyzing the vendor's weaknesses and strengths, but doing it in a way that allows you to understand how those weaknesses and strengths are going to play out for your unique needs. So we have some interesting tools to help you do that, and obviously very deep and highly critical research. We have other tools that can help you benchmark your digital effectiveness. And then one thing we do with all of our subscribers is advise and mentor them in successful technology decision making. That can be around overall roadmap strategy, stack audits, and of course, selecting technology. So as an analyst firm, we basically help you be successful in terms of whatever decisions you're trying to make, and make sure that it's backed up by really solid research. As I mentioned, we work only with buyers of technology. That makes us somewhat unique, maybe even completely unique in the analyst industry. We never consult to vendors. We never speak at their events. We never write white papers for them. We're totally on your side of the table, and that allows our research to be, quite frankly, the hardest hitting research out there today. We cover a variety of different technologies, put them all together on this so-called vendor map. And so this shows all of the different tools that we evaluate specifically by vendor. And you can see there's more than 160 on here. What we're going to be looking at today is the light purple line, the WCM line. And like a lot of technologies we cover, there's some big players like Oracle, Microsoft, Adobe, IBM, OpenText, of course, but the market is really predominantly dominated by kind of best of breed function point solutions. So it's a very large, diverse, highly fragmented marketplace. And of course, that makes it interesting for us as analysts, but potentially also very giving you a lot of really good choices as well. So I mentioned I started CMS Watch in 2001, and it was because of this. You might call this the mystical quadrant. Obviously, I'm making fun of the Gartner magical quadrant here. This idea that, there's a designated set of winners and losers that you can pick from, and that some analyst firm can give you a generic chart like this and tell you who to go with. And, that's just completely not true. Hopefully, we all understand that now. What you really need to do is understand your own specific requirements and what's the right fit for you, right? So it's not really about who generically is the better vendor or the weaker vendor, but what's the right fit for your enterprise. So that's what we're going to get at today. We're going to look at how do you evaluate the tools, what does the marketplace look at, some key trends in the WCM marketplace that bear on then how to select and how not to select. So it's going to be a pretty rapid-paced 25 minutes here, but feel free to chime in at any time with questions. Just use the questions tab in your GoToMeeting control panel. Okay. So the temptation is always to look at features or services. And these are important. And in our own evaluation research, we look at these kind of capabilities within a web content management platform, organized into 3 different columns here, which are groups of services, like technology services on the left, content services in the middle, and then experience services on the right. These are different capabilities that you may or may not want, that the vendor may or may not execute in a simple way or in a complicated way, or may or may not do at all. So features are important, but one of the things we've learned over the years is that we all obsess a little bit too much on features. These are really kind of abstract concepts, and they don't necessarily predict how well you're going to actually use the technology or how well it's actually going to work for you. So we really need to look beyond features and look at instead, what are business scenarios? What are the actual use cases? What are you trying to do with this technology? So this is the way that we evaluate, and we encourage you also to come up with your own use cases so you too can evaluate vendors as their fitness for you. So this is how we look at OpenText TeamSite, formerly from Interwoven, Autonomy, and HP. You wouldn't use it for the simpler use cases, potentially for some complex use cases. The reality is it's not particularly good these days at almost anything. But the idea here is that, you've got a set of things that you're trying to do from a business perspective, and how does the vendor match up against that, right? So our research can give you a real leg up on that, but then you want to go through a process of identifying what are the critical use cases that you're trying to satisfy and what's the right match. Of course, we shouldn't just be looking at the technology. You want to look at the vendor itself. And when it comes down to evaluating vendors, one of the key things that we spend a lot of time looking at, and you should as well, it's just the whole product ecosystem and the vendor ecosystem, not just in terms of, connectors and software partners, but really critically, what does the customer community look like? How often do they meet? Are there annual meetings? Are there meetups in different places? What about the customer extranet? What about different services partners if it's a complex platform? These are the sorts of things that we found over the years are really good predictor of the future viability of the vendor and the technology itself. Because vendors, of course, come and go. But the technology, obviously, if you've made an investment in it, you want it to endure. And the ecosystem is a really critical place, that we look at in terms of our evaluations, and you should definitely look at in terms of your vendor vetting. So here's an example, again, of TeamSite. Again, somewhat weak ecosystem. There are some professional services firms still around that can handle it. And there is some community around it that OpenText is trying to keep going. But in general, this is a fairly weak system with respect to strategic considerations. There are others often that are stronger. Often we see, for example, very strong ecosystems around open source tools. But sometimes issues around, roadmaps, obviously technical modernity is a huge issue because you don't want to be buying into a lot of technical debt. So you want to look at what are the use cases and then what are the strategic considerations that really matter. And you can go to our site and check out some tools where you can manipulate these things and get custom output. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But for now, let's talk about the WCM marketplace as a whole, right? So the marketplace can really be defined on kind of a complexity spectrum. So on the far left, you have, the most complex platforms. And on the far right, you have simpler products. So the difference between a platform and a product is a platform, you really need a developer on your team who's going to help you, not just in the initial implementation, but be able to support it going forward. So this red line here is between platforms and products. And very often with a product, you can get away without having a developer. Some of them, in fact, there's not even a role necessarily for a developer in like Terminal 4 on the update. The ones to the left, though, you definitely need a developer. And generally speaking, as you go further left, the platforms become richer, more widely robust in terms of capabilities, but also much more expensive and obviously complicated to implement. So there's a complexity spectrum here. And one of the things that you really want to understand is kind of where do your use cases fall on this complexity as well. One box I'll highlight here is the legacy platforms in the lower left. These are typically systems that people leave rather than buy afresh. There's, occasionally you'll see people experimenting with these tools. In general, these are platforms in very long-term decline. So we typically don't recommend putting those on your short list. That doesn't mean if you're already using, say, SharePoint or IBM for web content management that you should get rid of it, but it's probably not a great long-term investment. So again, one of the really key considerations here is product versus platforms, right? And platforms tend to demo very well. They tend to capture a lot of mind share. Products, on the other hand, do certain things really well right away. And so, there's always this kind of tension between the two. We're not making a value judgment here. Obviously, for more complex use cases, you're probably going to want to lean more towards the platform end of the spectrum. For simpler use cases, you'll want to lean more towards the product end of the spectrum. As we help our subscribers build shortlists, we'll often say, okay, this feels more like a platform play for you, but let's look at one more productized solution, just one, just to make sure that you can't get away with something simpler. Because in our experience, and our own surveys have borne this out, that there's generally higher customer satisfaction with simpler tools, usually because they allow them to be more agile. Of course, the issue is if there's a certain capability that's missing, then that's obviously can be a ceiling in terms of what you're trying to do with respect to digital. But another way of putting this is you have a greater risk of overbuying rather than underbuying. So that then brings us to looking at, what are some of the trends that are going on in the WCM space. And I think, one of the key things really to look at is to understand that web content management, while it used to be very central with respect to what you're trying to do digitally, now is really playing in a much broader sort of field of potential tools here. So this is our digital marketing engagement reference model that we use with our subscribers to help them understand their broader architecture. So there's a reference model that typically will customize, based on individual circumstances. You've got an enterprise data foundation at the bottom, then content and engagement management layer, of which web content and experience management is an important piece, but it's just a piece, right? You also need to be thinking about digital asset management, obviously marketing automation and email, social engagement, any number of different services here. And then, of course, there's a variety of corollary services in terms of marketing and delivery out towards all the different major channels. So WCM is just one piece of the pie. And again, this is another reason not to overload your WCM platform with a number of services that may not belong there, including email, including digital asset management, including social engagement, that are probably done better in a different platform, particularly if you're a mid-size or larger enterprise. So don't overload your WCM selection by loading it down with a number of particularly outbound marketing capabilities or asset management capabilities that probably don't belong there. There's a related point here that we're seeing, and this is a little bit more of an enterprise architecture approach, where we're seeing decision-making moving down in the stack, which is to say, again, you have all these application services at the top: CRM, email marketing, web content and experience management, events, print, so on and so forth. Each one of these are channels where you're going to be engaging with customers and prospects. But of course, we all want to do omni-channel marketing. We all want to do omni-channel messaging. We want to be able to orchestrate that. And that's pushing a number of marketing services below and underneath these different silos, including campaign and orchestration, analytics, customer data platform, what we're starting to call in yellow here the content marketing warehouse. We have themes, stories, components, variants. So these things then get abstracted beneath your WCM. And not everyone is getting to this point, but we're seeing this as kind of an emerging reference model. And so again, what this is suggesting is you shouldn't necessarily always be looking for your web content experience management system, which is driving primarily your web and potentially your mobile delivery channels, not necessarily, also use that to then manage data, to manage campaigns, to manage your lower level core base marketing stories. They're probably done in a more kind of channel neutral sort of way. So again, the larger theme here is being really clear about what's in the scope of WCM and not loading it down with a number of things that really don't belong there. So we think that there's a kind of a rethink coming on WCM. That your website is, of course, just another channel. You also have applications and social and email and mobile and everything else. And so that's pushing then decisioning kind of lower in the stack. There's a growing need then for so-called headless web content management that's not actually delivering your site, that may be providing content to interactive applications, and of course, single page applications. So all this means is a narrowing of scope for your WCM and your web content management system more as an order taker and not a decision maker. The one thing that is making this a little bit more complicated is the content is likely to get more componentized. So your WCM does need to be at least a little bit object-oriented in the way that it can assemble different content components for different types of engagement and delivery environments. So that is adding a little bit more complexity to it. But the bottom line here, once again, this is a recurring theme, is don't overbuy technology and don't load up too much into your WCM platform that doesn't belong there. Okay. So how do you go about selecting it? my colleague Jared and I wrote a book published by Rosenfeld Media called The Right Way to Select Technology. And the idea here is to apply design thinking to this process. So this, again, is going to help you keep it real. You're going to build a team, emphasize testing, and then iterate and adapt throughout this whole process. It's going to be a much more human-oriented process as well. So first, you want to build an interdisciplinary selection team. So by this, you want to have marketing, communications, definitely IT, but it should have a business chair with a separate project manager. You want to have a diverse set of stakeholders, and when people ask, well, what's the type of person I should have on? I would say curious people who are motivated around change, because a new platform is going to bring new capabilities and change. You want people who are excited about that on your team. You also don't want your team members to be too senior, though, because if they get too senior, then they won't be able to participate in what we're going to see here in a second is a very hands-on process. So you build kind of a core working multidisciplinary selection team. Then what you want to do is follow kind of classic design thinking. So in design thinking, typically you want to empathize and then come up with an initial definition and ideate some ideas, right? Then you test those ideas through prototyping and testing, and then you go through an iterative process of this. So the way we look at this from a selection standpoint, whether it's web content management or any other technology, is first you create stories, which are basically user journeys. Those user journeys can be designers, editors, marketers, end users, customers, prospects. When we're helping people with RFPs, we often even have developer stories, right? Because developers can be key personas in the system. Then you define it by creating an RFP where those stories are the center of that RFP rather than checklists. And then you build a short list of vendors that are likely to then be good prospects for actually fulfilling and executing on those stories. Then you start getting ideas by reviewing their proposals and down selecting to maybe 3, 4, 5 vendors that you're going to bring in for prototyping. And by that is by demoing. Demoing not their generic demos, but again, your stories. Now, along the way, you're adapting your stories as you learn, and you adapt them some more as you see the demos, and finally, you get down to maybe the most critical part of this, which is proof of concept with 2 finalists, right? And the difference between a proof of concept and a demo is in a proof of concept, you're hands-on with the technology. You're actually testing it yourself. So let's go through this really quickly. First, you want to create these testable stories or narratives. Get rid of as many of your spreadsheet items as you can. Vendors have seen them all. They can check all the boxes. The key question is not whether a vendor does something or what they do, but how they do it. So if it has to be, J2E compliant or something, don't just say must be J2E compliant. You say, how are you J2E compliant? You're going to have a much better answer. But the key thing is really what's going on the right, which is you're creating a narrative about, in this case, it's a very common use case for this university is to create a new microsite. So they basically want a microsite stamping machine. And this is how they want that machine to work. So it's to be, but it's more descriptive rather than prescriptive, right? You're describing sort of how you want it to work from a business perspective, but you're not saying there's a green button in the upper right-hand corner, right? So you create these to-be narratives that are then the soul of your RFP, the heart of your demos, and the things you're going to test against during that final bake-off or POC. So now you build the RFP, and our subscribers know we've got a lot of different samples that we can share around the right way to do this and sample RFPs sanitized that we've done before. But then you want to shortlist a set of vendor options whose fundamental strengths are going to align with your unique needs. Obviously, there's different core filters you may want to use there. Maybe that vendor and their partners are active in your region. You may care about licensing models in the upper right, although we find a lot of these models are converging as we see commercial and open source converge more, so that's less of an issue. Delivery model, obviously important. We're seeing less and less, obviously, on-premise, more and more in the cloud. Just make sure that with respect to cloud, you understand the difference between multi-tenant software as a service and single-tenant platform as a service. Products tend to be more multi-tenant software as a service. Platforms are almost always platform as a service because you need to modify that yourself, and so very often it's a single-tenant hosting in the cloud. Pros and cons to both. You just need to understand the implications of your decision. Then finally, obviously, the technologies, what are the technologies that are used underneath the hood that you may need to then utilize to customize the platform for your unique circumstances. We're finding that this is less and less a discriminator, and that's really a good thing, particularly as we move to cloud and as enterprises get more flexible about the sort of technologies they can support. Obviously, it still matters. Hopefully, it's not decisive in what should be, at the end of the day, a business decision. You want to apply some core filters, certainly, and we have tools that can help you do that. The more interesting thing is to come up with a quadrant that works for you. So this is using Real Story Group's Real Quadrant shortlist generator. And here it's an actual portals use case where on the left, the key use case is around internal collaboration. We want to build a collaboration portal and we want really low TCO. So you can see, say, Liferay and Plone are in the upper right, SAP's in the kind of loser quadrant, and maybe we include Microsoft and OpenText, Oracle in the picture, and we build a shortlist that way. Now, if I've got a very different use case around BI and dashboards, I want more of a dashboard type portal, maybe for our executives, and I know I'm going to need a lot of customization, so I want a professional services channel to help me, I get a completely reversed quadrant here, right? So it's the same research, same vendors, but I'm getting two different outputs. And this is to show you that depending on what you're trying to do, what your use cases are, what your strategic priorities are, you can have a very different set of vendors on your shortlist. Okay, so you come up with a shortlist, you get proposals, you have demos, you're doing this as a team, you're modifying your scripts as you go along, and as you learn more, then the final piece, this is the piece that many, many, many enterprises leave out, and you should never leave this out, is a final POC or bake-off. For WCM platform, typically you need a week with each vendor. So typically you do a week on, then take with one vendor A, and then you take a week off to get back to your work, and then you do week 2 with vendor B. We have a lot of templates that we share with our subscribers about the right way to do this, but the key thing is that it's hands-on. So often the first couple of days, you're actually getting trained on the platform. It amazes me how many enterprises buy WCM and other technologies without actually trying it. It's like going to buy a car and watching the salesperson drive around the lot in the car and say, ooh, that looked really good. That's a demo, right? What you want to do is actually get behind the wheel yourself. And obviously this is more complicated than driving a car, so you may need a full week for this. But the key thing is it's your scenarios, it's your content, you have to provide to the vendor, it's your people, and it's a real environment, right? Now, to be sure, it may be cloud-based. It's not necessarily going to be production code, but it's essentially a week-long sprint that you execute with the vendor. So you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about the technology. You learn a lot about what you're going to need to do to actually implement it properly. And you're going to learn a lot about the vendor and potentially any partner that they brought to the party. And then you really know what was the better fit between these two. It also gives you more time to negotiate on pricing and terms. And you always want to negotiate hard on pricing and terms. So, if you remember nothing else, what you want to do is adopt an iterative approach. All right. So you're iterating through an RFP or tender, then the demos, then the bake-off. You start with light requirements, story-based, and then refine those requirements over time through testing at every step in the process. Right? So this is applying design thinking to selecting WCM technology. We can tell you a lot more about the vendors and the marketplace and what's going on there, or you can find out yourself by licensing our WCM research. We evaluate 36 tools, all against the same set of scenarios that we identified. Again, since we only work on your side of the table, we're considered the toughest and hardest hitting, probably most critical. So if you want to know what are the strengths and weaknesses of these different technologies, you can find it in this research. If you would like to review a free sample, I believe it's of Adobe AEM actually, you can go to realstorygroup.com/excerpt and just download a free sample there. This is how you can engage with us going forward. If you're looking at this technology or you're undertaking a selection or you implement this stuff for a living, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to explore with you how our research can help you. In the meantime, if you have any questions at all or any comments or anything you disagree with, we always save 5 minutes here at the end for Q&A to really allow the Vox Pop to come out here. So we've already got a couple of questions, and I'll encourage anyone else who wants to join in to pipe in.